In the winter of 1888, a man sat across from a dying way of life and wrote down something he could not explain. He was an outsider on the southern plains, sent to record what was left of the Comanche before it disappeared for good. The great herds were gone, the old camps stood empty, and the people who had once ruled a stretch of country larger than most European nations were now confined, counted, and quietly written out of the future. But on one of those cold afternoons, an old Comanche man, once a keeper of medicine, told him about the bells. Not war bells, not the little brass trinkets traded off the backs of wagons. He described something far older, bells that could sing sickness out of a living body. Metal that, when struck in a certain way, could draw the fever out of a child, steady a shaking hand, and close a wound that should have rotted for weeks. The record keeper wrote it down the way you write down a thing you fully intend to laugh at later. I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. And then, according to the pages that survive, he stopped laughing, because the old man described the method with the flat, patient precision of someone reciting arithmetic, not myth. He named the tones. He named the timing. He described how the sound had to travel through water and through the chest, and how the wrong bell, cast from the wrong metal, could do the opposite of healing. Today, those pages are treated as a curiosity, when they are treated as anything at all. But if you follow the thread of what that old man said, it runs straight into territory the history books refuse to enter. It leads to a question about the entire pre-modern world. Why did our ancestors, poor and hungry as they so often were, pour staggering amounts of wealth into casting millions of bells and raising stone towers just to hold them in the air? What was all that sound actually for? This is the story the record keeper stumbled into, and this is the reason almost no one was ever meant to read it. To understand why a single page of testimony matters, you have to understand the year it was written. By 1888, the American frontier was closing like a fist. The Comanche, who a generation earlier had been the most feared light cavalry on the continent, were finished as a free people. Their world had collapsed inside 20 years. And into that collapse came a very particular kind of visitor. Not a soldier, not a missionary, a collector. All across the country, educated men had realized that the old cultures were dying faster than anyone could study them, and a strange race began. Notebooks were carried into reservations and mission houses and trading posts, and the last fluent elders were asked to empty their memories onto paper before those memories went into the ground with them. Whole languages, whole medical systems, whole libraries that had never been written down were being scribbled into ledgers by men who barely understood a word of what they were preserving. That is the crucial detail. The people writing these accounts were not believers. They thought they were recording superstition. They wrote down the healing songs and the sacred procedures the same way a butterfly collector pins a wing, with no intention of ever letting it fly. Which means that when something real slipped into those pages, something that actually worked, it was recorded by a hand that had no reason to invent it and no framework to explain it. That is what makes the Bell testimony so difficult to wave away. The man who wrote it down did not want it to be true. The old Comanche he spoke with had been, in the language of his people, a keeper, a holder of the practices that kept a band alive across brutal winters and constant war. And the practice he chose to describe, near the end of his life, to a stranger who would probably mock it, was the one about sound. He was careful to say it was not magic. That distinction mattered to him, and the record keeper noted it more than once. The old man insisted that what he was describing was a craft, as ordinary in its own way as tanning a hide or setting a bone. You had the right object, you used it in the right sequence, and the body answered. There was nothing to believe in. There was only whether you did it correctly. The object was a bell, though the word he used did not translate cleanly. It was a shaped piece of metal that held a single, clear voice when it was struck, and that voice could be aimed. He described placing the sick person low, near the ground, near still water when water could be found, because the tone travelled differently through the earth and the damp than it did through open air. He described striking the metal not once but in patterns, slow at first, then closer together, and holding certain notes until the sick person's breathing fell into step with the sound. And he described results: a child burning with fever whose skin cooled by morning, a man who could not stop shaking after a bad wound, brought back to stillness, pain that loosened its grip, sleep that finally came. The record keeper, to his credit, wrote down his own doubt right alongside the claims, but he also wrote down something that clearly unsettled him. The old man did not speak like a mystic reaching for words. He spoke like a technician describing a tool he had used 1,000 times and expected to keep working. The record keeper pressed him on the details, half expecting the whole thing to fall apart under questioning. It did not. The old man answered everyone. He explained that the size of the bell had to match the size of the person, that a small, clear bell was used for a child and a deeper, heavier one for a grown man. He explained that the healer had to strike from a set distance and never from directly above, because the tone behaved differently when it fell straight down onto a body. He talked about repeating the same treatment across several days, never all at once, because the sound worked the way water wears a stone, a little at a time. And he described one case in particular, a young woman who had been coughing blood through a long winter, whom he claimed to have brought back over the course of a full moon's worth of mornings, until she walked out of the lodge on her own 2 feet. The clerk wrote it all down. Then, in the margin, he added a single line admitting that he could not decide whether he was recording a fraud or a science he was simply too ignorant to recognize. Then he said the thing that turns this from a folk story into something much larger. He said his people had not invented it. He said the knowledge was old before the Comanche were a people, that it had come down through others who came before, and that once, long ago, there had been far greater bells than any he had ever seen. Bells the size of houses. Towers built for no other purpose than to hold them and throw their voices across whole valleys. And here is where the story stops being about one old man on the plains and starts being about the whole world you think you know. Because towers built to hold enormous bells are not a Comanche legend. They are standing over your head right now. Walk into almost any old town, anywhere on earth, and look up. You will find a bell tower. We have grown so used to them that we no longer see them the way you stop seeing your own front door. But step back and really look at what these structures represent, and the strangeness comes flooding back. For century after century, in societies where most people lived one bad harvest away from starvation, humanity spent a share of its wealth that is genuinely hard to comprehend on the casting of bells and the raising of towers to hold them. Bronze and copper are not cheap metals. A single large bell could swallow the metal wealth of an entire district and take the best craftsmen months to pour without cracking. And communities that could barely feed themselves did this again and again and again, until the old world was carpeted in bells from one coast to the other. We are told the reason, and the reason sounds sensible until you weigh it. Bells called people to prayer. Bells told the time. Bells warned of fire and flood and enemies at the gate. All of that is true. But none of it explains the sheer scale of the investment or the obsessive care poured into the sound itself. You do not need a perfectly tuned instrument of bronze to tell a farmer it is noon. A crude iron slab beaten with a hammer would do the job for a fraction of the cost. Yet our ancestors did not settle for noise. They chased tone. They hired masters who guarded their metal formulas like state secrets, men who understood exactly how the balance of copper and tin would change the voice of the finished bell, and how long that voice would hang in the air after the hammer fell. The men who cast these bells were not ordinary tradesmen. They were a closed order, moving from town to town, carrying formulas that passed only from father to son, and were never written where a rival might find them. They dug their casting pits in the ground beside the very church that had hired them, because the finished bell was too heavy and too fragile to move far, and they laboured for weeks over fire hot enough to kill a careless man. When the metal was finally poured and cooled and lifted, the work was still not done. They tuned it by hand, shaving thin curls of bronze from the inside of the bell, striking it, listening, and shaving again, chasing a single exact note that most of the townsfolk could not even tell apart from the note beside it. Ordinary people do not spend that kind of blood and treasure and secrecy to make a loud clang at noon. They spend it when the exact sound is the entire point. Why does the exact tone matter, if the only goal is to make a loud sound at a distance? That is the question the Comanche testimony forces into the open, because the old man's answer, stripped of everything else, was simple. The tone was the point. The tone was the medicine. And if he was right, then every one of those towers was never really a clock or an alarm. It was infrastructure. Public infrastructure, built into the center of every town, humming over the population day after day, generation after generation. Consider what a bell tower actually is when you describe it plainly and forget what you have been told it is for. It is a tall structure, engineered with obsessive attention to resonance, placed at the highest and most central point of a settlement, designed to broadcast a precisely tuned frequency across every home, every field, and every body within range, at fixed intervals, for as long as the town shall stand. If a stranger described that machine to you, and never once used the word church, you would assume it was a device. You would ask what it was doing to the people underneath it, and this is where the thread the old man handed us runs into a much larger and much stranger idea. Because the pattern he described, sound as a healing technology carried in shaped metal, does not appear only among the Comanche. It appears everywhere, in fragments, scattered across cultures that supposedly never touched one another. In the old monasteries of Europe there are accounts of bells rung over the sick, not merely to comfort them but to treat them, rung in careful sequences during outbreaks of plague, in a way that made little sense to the later historians who filed it under superstition and moved on. There are traditions of healing shrines built around resonant chambers, of towers that were said to sing on certain days, of metal instruments carried by physicians long before anyone spoke of germs. In cultures divided by entire oceans you find the same buried notion surfacing again and again, that the right sound, aimed the right way, does something to the flesh. You can find the fragments if you go looking for them. In the Far East there are ancient traditions of striking metal bowls and letting the tone move over and through the body of a sick or troubled person. In the old quarantine towns of Europe there were bells rung on schedules that had nothing to do with prayer and everything to do with the hours physicians believed the sickness was strongest. There are records of great temple bells whose sound was said to settle the mind and steady the breath of anyone who stood beneath them. Taken one at a time, each of these is easy to dismiss as folklore dressed up in metal. Taken together, they start to look less like 100 separate superstitions and more like the scattered rubble of one collapsed building, each people left holding whatever chunk landed nearest to them when the roof finally came down. Historians have a word for beliefs that show up on their own all over the world. They call it coincidence, or they call it the simple mind reaching for the same comfort in the dark. But there is another explanation, and it is the one this whole forgotten corner of history keeps circling back toward. What if it is not many separate inventions at all? What if it is one inheritance, one older body of knowledge that was once shared across the entire world, then broken into pieces and scattered, so that each surviving culture kept only a shard of the original whole? The Comanche elder said it plainly. The knowledge came from those who came before. There had been greater bells once, and greater towers, built by people whose reach we can no longer picture. This is the heart of the buried account of our own past. That somewhere behind the version of history we were handed, there stood an older and more advanced civilization, one that understood energy and resonance and the atmosphere itself in ways we are only now fumbling back toward, and its knowledge did not vanish cleanly. It was inherited in pieces by the peoples who came after, half understood, passed down as ritual once the reasoning behind it was lost. The medicine keeper on the plains, striking his metal in careful patterns over a fevered child, may have been the last working link in a chain that reached back to something enormous. He knew the steps. He no longer knew who first discovered them, or how the great bells had been built, or what powered the towers that once held them. And if that older world truly existed, then the most important question is not how it rose, it is how it fell so completely that we forgot it was ever there. To see how such a thing is possible, you only have to look at the buildings that came after it, and notice how little we actually know about them. Across the old cities of the world stand structures that we did not build and cannot fully explain. Vast stone halls raised, we are told, by societies that lacked the tools, the machines, and the wealth such construction should have demanded. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment now, then come back. Ornate palaces and exhibition halls that appear in the historical record almost fully formed, then are torn down within a few short years, their images surviving only in fading photographs. There are cities that seem to sit on top of older cities, their ground floors buried, their first windows sunk halfway below the modern street, as though a wave of earth once rolled through and swallowed the lower stories whole. The official history has an answer for each of these things, taken one at a time, but laid side by side they begin to describe a pattern, a world that was older, grander, and more capable than the one that replaced it. A great forgetting that fell across the 19th century like a curtain, after which the survivors carried on inside inherited buildings whose true purpose they no longer understood, ringing inherited bells whose true function they had already begun to lose. And records have a way of disappearing in exactly the moments they matter most. Great archives burned, old libraries were lost to fires that always seemed to arrive at a convenient hour. Collections were shipped away, misfiled, or quietly thinned until the awkward volumes were simply gone. Whether by accident or by design, the paper trail that might have explained the old world grew thinner with every passing decade, until what remained was a scatter of loose pages that no longer added up to a picture. A single clerk's notebook from a reservation on the southern plains was never going to reverse that, but it was also too small and too strange to be worth anyone's trouble to destroy, and so it slipped through. One honest account of a lost technology, preserved by nothing more than its own unimportance. And in the middle of that curtain falling, on the far edge of a continent, an old Comanche keeper was quietly explaining that the bells had once been medicine. He was not describing a legend from his own imagination. He was describing a fragment of the very thing that was being erased everywhere else at the very same time. Now hold the two halves of this together. The great towers of the old world, engineered for resonance and placed at the center of every settlement, and a dying man's testimony that shaped metal, struck in the right pattern, could reach into the body and heal it. Put those two facts in the same room, and the towers stop looking like monuments. They start looking like the last surviving pieces of a machine that once ran across the whole earth. There is one more thread, and it is the strangest of all. It is the metal itself. The old bells were poured from bronze, an alloy built mostly on copper. And copper is not a random choice. Copper is the metal we reach for whenever we want to move energy through the world. It carries electricity better than almost anything we can afford to use. It answers to magnetism. It is threaded through every machine you own, precisely because it is so willing to pass unseen forces from one place to another. The old world buried copper in its towers, wrapped its holy places in it, and shaped its healing instruments from it, long before anyone claimed to understand what copper does. The buried account asks a simple question about that. What if the old builders knew exactly what copper does? What if the towers, the domes, the great bronze bells, were never only decorative or devotional, but were tuned to gather and move the natural energy that hangs in the air and runs through the ground? A cathedral, seen this way, is not a building. It is an instrument, and a bell hung at its heart is not an ornament. It is the part that speaks, the part that turns silent, invisible force into a tone the human body can feel. The old man on the plains had no words for electricity or magnetism, but he described placing the sick near water and near the earth, and striking copper-bearing metal in patterns until the body fell into step. Strip away the century between his language and ours, and he is describing the same principle the grand towers were built on. Energy, gathered and shaped by metal, aimed at the living body through sound. And here is where the story turns dark, and where the economics finally show their teeth. Bells do not survive easily. Bronze is valuable, and a bell is simply valuable metal held in a useful shape. Across the centuries, whenever a war came, the bells came down. They were pulled from their towers by the thousands and melted into cannon. When the fighting stopped, some were recast, and many were not. Then the next war came, and it happened again. Over and over, the accumulated bell wealth of the old world was poured into the furnaces and turned into weapons and coin. The towers that survived were left holding replacements, newer castings, often cruder, often tuned to nothing in particular. Think about what that means if the old man was right. If the tone was the medicine, then every one of those meltings was not just the loss of an object, it was the destruction of a machine, a slow, centuries-long dismantling of a public health system that no one alive remembered building, carried out by people who believed they were only harvesting metal for the next war. And a certain kind of knowledge does not survive that process either. When the objects vanish, the practices attached to them begin to rot. Within a few generations, the reason for the tuning is forgotten. The careful sequences become empty ritual, then folklore, then embarrassment. By the time the modern age arrives, anyone who suggests that sound can touch the body is dismissed as a peddler of nonsense, and the dismissal is delivered, conveniently, by exactly the institutions that stood to gain the most from it. Because think about who benefits from the forgetting. A tower that hums healing over a whole town, for free, forever, is a disaster for anyone who intends to sell health by the dose. A cure that lives in the air, available to the poorest family in the settlement, cannot be owned, cannot be rationed, and cannot be turned into a fortune. But a cure that comes in a bottle can. As the modern medical and industrial order took its shape, an enormous amount of money came to rest on a single idea. That healing is a scarce product, manufactured by experts and purchased by the sick. An older world in which the remedy was ambient and unowned was not merely inconvenient to that order, it was a threat to its foundation. You do not have to imagine a single dark room where men agreed to erase the bells. History almost never works that way. You only need incentives, all pointed in the same direction, running for a very long time. The metal was worth more as weapons. The old knowledge was worth less than the products that replaced it. The towers were more useful as symbols of faith than as instruments of health. And so, piece by piece, for reasons that each seemed perfectly sensible on its own, the technology was melted, forgotten, and finally laughed at. Nobody had to burn the library. They only had to stop teaching anyone how to read it, and then wait. The Comanche were caught in the very last moment of that long erasure. Their world was broken so quickly and so completely that the chain of teaching simply snapped. The old man who spoke in 1888 had students who would never finish their training, because the life that training belonged to no longer existed. He was pouring the last of it into a notebook held by a man who thought he was collecting quaint superstitions. In a way, that record-keeper was the final link in the chain. He caught the knowledge as it fell, without ever understanding that he was catching anything at all. And yet the fragment survived. That is the strange grace hidden inside this story. The old man's testimony was written down precisely because the person recording it did not take it seriously enough to censor it. It was too minor to bury. So it sat in an archive, harmless, ignored, and waiting. Now, look at what our own age has quietly rediscovered, and ask yourself whether the fragment still looks harmless. We now have machines that use focused sound to break apart stones inside the body without a single cut. We have found that certain frequencies of vibration can encourage broken bone to knit and heal faster than it otherwise would. Sound is used to see the unborn child in the womb, to map the living interior of a person, to shatter and to mend. Serious researchers study how tone affects the nervous system, how a steady rhythm can slow a racing heart, how the human body, which is mostly water, responds to vibration in ways we are only beginning to chart. None of this is mysticism. It sits in ordinary hospitals, billed and insured, and every bit of it rests on the same foundation the old man laid out by hand, that a precisely aimed sound can reach into flesh and change it, and the deeper researchers push into it, the stranger and more familiar the findings become. There is serious study of how specific frequencies calm inflammation and quiet the nervous system, of how rhythm and vibration can pull a distressed body back toward balance, of how sound can be focused as finely as a surgeon's blade. Each new paper is written as though it were breaking fresh ground. And each one, without ever meaning to, inches back toward the same territory the old man had already mapped by memory, using a bell, a patch of damp earth, and a patience measured in mornings rather than minutes. We are not discovering something new. We are limping back toward something old, one narrow slice at a time, with no idea that the whole map was drawn long ago and then thrown away. We did not inherit this from him. We stumbled back into a corner of it on our own, congratulating ourselves on the discovery, never once noticing that a dying man on the southern plains had described the principle in plain language a century before, and that towers built for the same purpose had been standing over our heads the entire time. That is the thought that is hard to shake once you have had it, not that the old man was a lone genius, but that he was ordinary, a working practitioner of something that used to be common, and that we are the ones who forgot. We melted the instruments. We buried the manuals in archives no one bothers to read. We taught our children that the towers were only ever about the hour and the prayer, and that the idea of healing sound was a fairy tale for people who did not know any better. The old man left one warning, and the record keeper wrote it down almost as an afterthought, which is probably the only reason it survived. The wrong bell, he said, cast from the wrong metal and aimed the wrong way, does not heal, it harms. The same tool that can draw sickness out can drive it deeper. The power was never in believing. It was in knowing exactly what you were doing. And a world that has forgotten the healing use of a thing tends to keep only the crude and the harmful versions of it, ringing the wrong metal at the wrong hours, and proudly calling it tradition. So here is where the pages from 1888 finally leave us. A man who had every reason to invent nothing described a technology of sound that healed the living body. He insisted it was a craft rather than a mystery. He traced it back to a lost and greater world whose enormous bells and singing towers he could only sketch from memory. He was recorded by a skeptic who did not believe a single word of it. His people were scattered before he could ever pass the knowledge on, and the objects that carried it, all across the earth, were melted down for war and coin until only the mute stone towers remained, holding replacement bells that no longer knew their own purpose. Maybe it is all coincidence. Maybe an old man near the end of his life spun a comforting story, and a bored clerk wrote it down, and the echoes we find in every other culture are nothing but the human mind repeating itself in the dark. That is the safe conclusion. It is the one you are supposed to reach, and the one that asks nothing further of you. But the next time you walk past one of those towers, the ones we pass under 1,000 times without a single glance, look up and hold one question in your mind. We were told these were raised to mark the hour and to call the faithful. So why did people who owned almost nothing spend so much of it chasing a perfect tone? Why did they aim that tone so carefully at the streets and the homes and the bodies below? And why, of everything the old world built, were these the machines that were pulled down first, melted first, and forgotten most completely of all? The old man on the plains gave his answer before his world went silent. He said the bells were medicine. He said we truly used to know. He did not ask the stranger to believe him, and he did not seem to care much whether anyone ever would. He only wanted it set down somewhere, so that when the world was finally ready to remember, the memory would be sitting there waiting. And then, with no one left to teach, and no time left to teach them, he handed the last of it to a stranger who believed he was only writing down a dream.